Hello, everybody, and welcome to your small group video. I guess this is a little bit different where usually our small groups are in gender and grade, but if you're in high school, your small group is usually just your grade, but now you have split off for this series into both gender and grade. So this is your first night hanging out, and as per usual, why don't you go around in a circle in your small group and go through each other's name, go through your high of the week and the low of the week. Go. So last week we launched our dating series, I guess.
Called Loveology.
Yeah, called Loveology. This week we're continuing it. Last week we talked about love and what love is and what love isn't and how our culture often gets it wrong. And so this week we're actually going to dive more specifically into dating. When I was younger, especially because I got married last year and I've been dating Emily for 7 years before that. So most of my dating happened before Emily, obviously, because then we got married. But I remember, but I remember at the beginning when I was a Christian and trying to figure out dating, and essentially, I just kind of wanted to do my own thing, and I wanted to do what most of the culture does. Or when it came to dating, I just wanted to date for fun. That there was people I wanted to date and people you want to do stuff with, and so like, oh, I'll just date them. And so I dated a bunch of different people, and it led to me having a not great reputation, where even when it came to me and Emily dating, one of the things and one of the reasons why she was hesitant to even date me in the first place was because I was kind of known as like a serial dater. Ooh. Where I would just go from relationship to relationship, and as soon as I didn't have one, I would find one immediately. And it wasn't
like the average length of your relationships.
Some are longer than others. It depends on the grade. In like grade 9, we're talking like a month to 2 months.
Okay.
If we're in grade 9, okay. Mm-hmm. But as I got older, I don't know, it was kind of just random. We're somewhere like a week.
Wow.
Some were like 3 months. One was like 2 years.
Okay.
And then after that 2-year one, there was a bunch of like 2 weeks, which led up to me dating Emily. And I kind of thought initially that dating was just like this fun thing that you did. Obviously, I knew because I went to church and went to youth group. They're like, oh, there's more to dating than this. But I kind of didn't act in a way like I believed it, that I just kind of dated flippantly and dated whoever was available and didn't really take a lot of thought into it. And that's honestly kind of how our culture sees dating, where it's usually seen as this flippant thing that you kind of do for fun. It's rare that it's really for marriage and that you're really intentional. That often kind of playing the dating game is the way our culture works. And to be honest, that kind of dating doesn't really work. And it couldn't be further from the truth of like it being fun. It actually causes a lot of issues. It causes a lot of damage. It caused a lot of damage in my relationship, especially where I finally was dating someone I actually wanted to marry. But in that relationship, they constantly felt the tension of like, yeah, but would this guy just date someone else immediately if he wasn't with me? Because that's kind of what he did. And it created all these different issues in my life where going from person to person might be fun in the moment, but actually creates like a pattern, not just in your brain, but in your habits and in the way you see people and in the way you see dating. And so our main idea, or my main idea, I don't know if it's Tiana's, I don't fully know how this works when we're teaching
you. I agree with your main idea.
You agree with my main idea, is that dating isn't a game. And especially if we're looking at what it looks like to date as Christians and how God actually designed dating and marriage and sexuality, that dating is actually something that should be serious. You shouldn't go around like I did on like serial dates and just dating whoever, that it should be something that you put a lot of thought and effort into and isn't done flippantly. So when we look at dating, and specifically dating in the Bible, you'll often find that there isn't anything, because
not a lot there.
No, there's not a lot there. You can't find a verse on dating because dating is more of a modern invention. It hasn't been around for that long, that in most cultures and most places, what happened was you would have an arranged marriage where your parents would decide you marry this person.
There is courting. That's like an old-fashioned word that was sort of like dating. And fun fact, Luke, my husband, called my dad and asked permission to court me, which my dad responded with, "Who says court anymore?"
Wow, well done, Luke. That's not what I did. And that's not what most of you do, to be honest. You just kind of start dating someone, and dating isn't really found in scripture. It doesn't mean that it has nothing to say about it. It actually has a lot to say about how you do it. It's just that if you're looking for a specific verse on here's how God says you should date, you're not going to find it. What you'll usually find is this thing called like a betrothal period, which was kind of like courting, where someone will make an agreement to marry somebody. And there's usually a long amount of time that takes place. So, for example, Joseph and Mary, it was just Christmas. They were essentially engaged or betrothed to each other to be married. Someone decided, either their parents or maybe Joseph himself was like, hey, I would like to marry you. And it was kind of like this big thing in Jewish culture where then it was like, oh, like that was very serious. And you would go through around a 1 to 2 year period of essentially dating as we would see it, but it wasn't dating. It was more like engagement. And so when it comes to dating, when you look at it biblically, it should be with the intent of something serious, that you shouldn't date flippantly, that it should be something that you're doing because you ultimately want to marry that person. And in our culture, we almost have this like myth of the one, which is actually a Greek idea of like, you have to find this special person out there. And the whole point of dating is to find like the one.
Like your soulmate.
Your soulmate.
Yeah.
The one person who you were designed to be with. And biblically, that's not a thing. That if you read scripture, there isn't this idea that there's like the one out there that you're like searching for, and that's why you need to date. The one biblically is the person that you essentially get married to. So once you say I do, that person becomes the one, but there are a bunch of different people who could potentially be the one.
The other thing with the one myth is that it implies that you're incomplete on your own.
Yeah.
Which is also not true.
No.
And so there's that, you got to find your other half, or like the compatible piece to your life, which is the other part of the myth, that you need someone to be whole.
Yeah, which isn't true.
Yeah.
And so, speaking of the one, Jesus' kind of view of this and marriage and how serious dating and that kind of stuff is he, in Mark chapter 10, says this at verse 7. Jesus says, "This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one, since they are no longer two, but one. Let no one split apart what God has joined together." So in Jesus' eyes, you aren't out there an incomplete person looking for the one, that you actually become one when you are married. And it's not that you are a incomplete person who needs to fill a hole in your life when you're single. It's more that when someone says I do and actually gets married, those two people actually become one. Something I heard when I was younger that I didn't always listen to, but was actually really great advice, was that instead of being so concerned about finding the one and the perfect person, you should actually be way more focused on like becoming the one, in the sense of you should be more worried about becoming the person that the person you would want to marry, or the kind of person you're looking for, is looking for.
And then the other thing I've heard is that if marriage is something that you're hoping for in your life, you always have the opportunity to be working towards a good marriage.
Yeah.
Even when you're not married. All your choices and things that you're doing, disciplines you're learning in life, even like skills, like fun skills or whatever, right, are all things that potentially are investments into a future marriage.
Yeah.
And so just because you haven't found someone that you're interested in at this point doesn't mean you can't work towards a future great marriage wherever you're at. Okay, so in your guys' small groups, we want you to chat about that idea. What do you think about focusing more on becoming the one you're one day looking for, versus just looking for someone? Do you think this is good advice, bad advice? Do you think with where you're at in life and your grade and age, it's something you can actually realistically do now? Does that sound hard or easy? So, Aiden, do you have any practical advice then? If the Bible doesn't really talk about dating, how can we glean wisdom from it and apply it to dating?
Yeah. So, again, just because it doesn't talk about it doesn't mean it doesn't have anything to say. It does. And if there were kind of like 3 things that I would want you all to grasp or understand or be like, yes, I don't know, I'm going to live this out. And the first thing, and the most important thing, and one thing that is controversial in the year 2023, is a shared faith.
It's 2024.
Oh, yeah. No, we're recording this earlier. But yeah, it is 2024 now. But you should have a shared faith. That this is actually something Scripture talks about that's pretty important. I'll dive into why, but there's a verse that kind of highlights this, and it says this. So Paul says, "Don't team up with those who are unbelievers. How can righteousness be a partner with wickedness? How can light live with darkness? What harmony can there be between Christ and the devil? How can a believer be a partner with an unbeliever?" So what Paul is talking about here isn't necessarily dating. He actually is talking about this in a lot of ways in all of life, but it really is highlighted in marriage, and specifically marriage. And Paul talks about this quite a bit, that if you are in a relationship as someone who wants to follow Jesus and you choose to be in a relationship with someone who doesn't, that's going to be really difficult. That people who often are in those scenarios and in those relationships find that it's a struggle. It's a struggle for both parties. It's a struggle for the person who doesn't believe in Jesus, and it's a struggle for the person who doesn't. And the thing is that you're in a place in life where you are not married yet, and you get to choose the kind of person you're going to marry. And if following Jesus is important to you, you're going to want to follow, or not follow, but be with someone who's wanting to follow Jesus with you. Jesus also uses this analogy where he says, don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. And I used to think when I was younger that it meant like eggs, where like there are eggs and there's yolks, and your yolk needs to be the same size as the person you're with. Yeah, it's what
not even the same cooked level. That's where I thought you were going.
Just the same size. Where there's bigger eggs and smaller eggs, you want the same. That's not what he means.
No, not at all.
A yoke was like this wooden thing that you would put on two animals. Then they would essentially steer a cart in a direction. And what would happen back in those days, if you had a yoke, and you had, for example, like an ox, which is a way bigger, stronger animal than a donkey, and you yoke them together, they would actually just end up going in circles, that they would never go in any direction because the ox would always overpower the donkey. And so your cart would never get to the destination you want to. And so what Jesus is saying there is essentially that if you choose to yoke yourself, to tie your life to someone who doesn't share the same faith in Jesus, you're probably going to sometimes feel like you're spinning in circles, and you're not going to head to the destination you're wanting to go. Just to be honest, I would say that you shouldn't consider dating someone who's not a believer yet. That maybe they'll come to believe, and that's great. But for now, if your life is heading in this direction and that's where you want it to head, and you want to partner with someone who's going to head in the opposite direction, that's going to cause a ton of tension, and in the long run isn't going to be helpful. And there are lots of people who are able to do that well, but I haven't met anybody who says like, yeah, like this is super easy and great. That for a lot of people, it is a struggle. And it's not that you can't do it and your life is doomed if it happens. It's just that your relationship is always going to have a tension if both of you are heading in two different directions. And so if you're starting out dating, find someone who's as passionate about Jesus as you are. The second rule or advice I would have is that if you're dating someone, you guys should have clear boundaries. That should be something you talk about right away. It should be something that comes up. And if you don't know what a boundary is, essentially it's a guardrail that will help prevent you from heading down a path sexually that you don't want to go. And if you're a follower of Jesus and want to follow what Jesus says, you'll set up these things that are farther away from like having sex before marriage that will help you to not have sex before marriage. So you'll have these different boundaries, and even not just with sex, but with other things in your life that are helpful, just to help you head on the path that you are hoping to head on. And so Jesus...
sorry. Well, and I think when you're talking about boundaries, again, you're not just talking about once you're in a relationship, you should make some boundaries, but even starting to learn to set boundaries for yourself, to have healthy habits and have sexual integrity in your own life as a single person. And that's only going to serve you well when you do find someone potentially to be in a relationship with. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, where he's giving this big teaching known as the Sermon on the Mount, he says this: "You have heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery," which is to cheat on your spouse. "But I say that anyone who even looks at a woman or a man with lust has already committed adultery with her or him in their heart." So he's setting a boundary way far away from physically doing something with someone that you would regret. Yeah. He's talking about putting a guardrail up even in your mind. Yeah. Where for a lot of us, we feel like that sin is just something you physically do.
it can also be something that you spiritually do, especially when it comes to something like lust. A lot of lust that happens in your life is not usually in person. To lust after someone is to think about them sexually in a way that someone with their spouse could think, but they're not your spouse. It's essentially to treat them like an object. Even not so. You could do it in a way that you think is loving, but you guys aren't married yet. And so to step outside of this is to actually step outside of the way God designed marriage and to corrupt it into something different. So instead of waiting, essentially, to use an example of like Adam and Eve, where they had this like tree that was really awesome, and God was like, hey, this tree's awesome, but don't eat of it yet. That's kind of like sex, where God's like, hey, sex is great, sex is awesome, and we'll dive into that more next week. But essentially, the way this thing was designed, it was designed for marriage, and to use it outside of it is actually to misuse it, and is actually going to cause a lot of damage, not to you, just you, but even to the people that you're with or thinking about or whatever. And in the moment, you're not thinking about it. Your goal isn't to like bring this thing into your life that is going to cause pain and misery and like struggle and regret that you're not really thinking. It's probably why it's happening. But if that's the point, is you want to set up things that will stop you from getting to that place so that you can actually not have regret, not live with shame, not live with those different things. And of course, there's forgiveness in Jesus, that Jesus forgives me for every time I broke a boundary and did something that was outside of the way he designed marriage and sexuality to be. But that doesn't mean that the consequences of it still aren't felt in my life and in other people's lives.
For sure. I think in my own, even though I wasn't a serial dater like you've defined, I definitely had in the couple relationships that I had, and even in my relationship with Luke before we were married, we had certain boundaries and things that we had talked about, some things we didn't talk about. And then, my personality is not so rebellious. So I want to know where that line is, but then I want to be able to like go right up into the line. Yeah. And that's also
how
dangerous.
Close can we get before it's too, which is often people's question. It's not like, how far can I stay away from possibly like committing sexual sin? It's always like, how close can I get before we know that, oh, this is actually sin now at this point.
So that was more my lesson, was not trying to figure out exactly how far was too far, but like, what am I really working towards? And in a lot of ways, it wasn't actually until after I was married that I actually really understood that a healthier perspective was actually to think of what kind of relationship do I want in the future and be focused on that. And then it makes those decisions easier. And those boundaries, they're there. You know where the line is, but you're not actually focused on them. You're focused more on the relationship you want and the health that you want in that. And that's a much better perspective to have. Yeah. And I think, like you said, so much of it is in our mind. And that's what Jesus was alluding to in this verse here, is that the battle is often here more than our actions. Yeah. And so you get to do a lot of that even before you're in a relationship and start working on that too.
Yeah. And so what this can look like John Mark Comer, who wrote the book that this series is based on, he talked about how with his wife, when they were dating, they had like a rule that if they were ever turned on, that whatever they were doing was over and they would go home, which is wild. I remember reading that when I was younger and I was like, that means a lot of times you're going home. And he's like, yeah, but that was the point. And it was this thing that was far away. But if you ever got to the point of being like, uh-oh, then you'd be like, oh, we're going home. Okay, that's great. And they would kind of go in their separate ways, and it actually really worked. And it wasn't because being turned on was a bad thing, but it was like, we know that if we hit this point and we just keep going, things are not going to usually end well. And this will look different for everybody, that not everybody's boundaries are going to be the same as everybody else's, but the goal should be that we as followers of Jesus should want to follow Jesus, and that includes our sexuality. And God isn't trying to hold out on us and like control us and stop us from like experiencing the fun that non-Christians are experiencing. That just like how in the Garden of Eden, God wasn't stopping them from eating the fruit because he was trying to hold out on them. And Satan wanted them to feel like he was, that actually God was mean and was restrictive and was trying to control them, when actually he was just trying to prevent them from bringing death and sin and pain into the world. And in a similar way, that's what God is doing here with sexuality.
Is that, you have the verse Song of Songs 8:4 about where his advice was to not excite your love before it's time.
Yeah.
That's like what you were talking about.
Do I have that
you
right
have
there?
That under friendship.
Oh, yeah. Well, With that being said, why don't we move along
I
to
feel
our
like
third
you're
point,
like going right into that. It's perfect.
to friendship. And this is actually, all of these points are important, but this is actually really important. And something, especially in your culture, that is not normal, where it is actually rare in school to date someone who's already your friend. That often you date someone and see if maybe you become friends along the way, which is the opposite order of what it should be, and actually isn't that helpful. And so, yeah, like you said, Song of Solomon is a book in the Old Testament. It's written by this guy named King Saul, and he
Solomon.
did a lot of things. Yeah.
Not King Saul.
Oh, yeah, Solomon, not Saul. I went to Bible college, I promise. King Solomon. And he was super wise. He was a smart guy. He essentially wrote a book that was a love story that's in the Bible. That's
Like a
really
poem,
interesting.
right?
Yeah,
Or
it's like a
song?
whole poem
Yeah.
of like this love story of him and this girl. And so in Song of Solomon, what chapter?
8:4. Chapter 8, verse 4.
Solomon says this. So this is the young woman of the story talking. And she says, "Promise me, O woman of Jerusalem, not to awaken love until the time is right." What is being said there, essentially, is that there is a time for love, that there is a time for all kinds of different things, but actually you shouldn't be quick to awaken that time. Don't be in a rush to date somebody, because we often are. In our culture, it's like as soon as there is a mutual liking, you should date immediately, because why not? And scripture would say that that's kind of unwise, especially if you don't know each other. So me and Emily knew each other for years before we dated. But most of the other people I dated and that she dated, we didn't. We just kind of jumped into it. And that's normal in our culture. But it is unwise because you don't know what that person is like away from you. And also your relationship doesn't know how to, if you don't start with a friendship, you have to then be romantically interested and become friends instead of being friends and then becoming romantically interested, which to you in this point might not seem like a big difference, but it is.
The science says that the butterfly feeling of being infatuated with someone is the term they give, scientifically lasts about a year.
Which is...
So it can last a long time where you
Yeah.
feel like, oh man, I really like this person, really like this person. But after a year, they say is when you actually like have more of a realistic view of that person. And then you're like, oh.
Yeah.
So Aiden has outlined 3 principles for dating when thinking about dating. A shared faith, something you really need to think about and consider. Setting some boundaries for yourself, even before in relationships, and especially if you want to enter into a relationship with someone. And then the idea of friendship and pursuing a friendship as the base of a relationship. Again, maybe before you start a relationship, but certainly as a foundation for your relationship. So of these 3, which do you find the most helpful? Which do you think is going to be the hardest in your life or to live out? Maybe you disagree with one of them. What are your thoughts on these 3 principles?
Dating isn't a game. That it should be something that we as followers of Jesus do take seriously, that our culture often makes it into this flippant thing, but it really shouldn't be. That if you're dating, it should be because you are in a stage where you want to get married. And if you are not in a place where you feel like you could see yourself being married in like 2 years or whatever, it's probably not time to date. That the whole goal of dating somebody is marriage. And if you are in a place where you're like, yeah, I'm not going to do that, then that's probably like, oh, that's great. Now's probably not the time. You might find yourself in a place where you're like, oh yeah, I do feel that. And that's great. Then
I have more stats for you.
Oh, you have more stats?
Yep.
Wow.
Only 1% of relationships that begin before graduation last.
Yeah. Some of you can date in high school. It'll end up okay. If you were to ask me if you should, I would say no. High school me would have thought that was crazy. But like Tiana said, 99% of you aren't going to make it. It's probably worth waiting.
If you are thinking about it,
don't
forget to consider where you're at with your faith and where this other person is with their faith.
Yeah.
Have you set some boundaries? Have you talked about that?
Mm-hmm.
And do you actually have a foundation of friendship? These are really important things to consider if you find yourself wanting to date. Yeah, and to become the kind of person you're one day looking for is looking for.
Wow.
What a good time back.
And that's because dating isn't a game.
No. And so we'd love for you guys to take a minute to discuss any last thoughts and to pray. And it might be a good time even to pray for each other. Maybe people have some past pain or hurts or things that they want to let go of, because even if you found yourself dating up until now, that doesn't mean that you've messed up and that you're damaged goods or anything like that. God is the God who makes all things new. But it means that this can be a point where you start fresh and think differently. And there's a lot of hope and freedom in that.
Yeah. And this is the space to do that too. Because if you're not going to do it in small group with a group of people who are like at least semi-interested in Jesus or curious, where else are you going to have these conversations? And everything that's said in small group should stay in small group. It's like Fight Club. You guys don't know what Fight Club is, but
no, they don't. And I hope they don't.
Yeah, it's a good movie, but you shouldn't watch it. And I didn't recommend it. But it should be that you guys should have some discretion as to what is said here should be left here. And you should feel the ability to be open about how you're feeling and the thoughts you have, or even difficulties that you're struggling with, and be able to talk about those things and pray about those things together. So, and
always know too that your small group leaders, as well as Aiden and I, if you'd rather be in an even smaller setting to discuss some of these really sensitive things, feel free to reach out. We would love to chat with you, meet with you at the beanery or something if you just want someone to talk through some stuff, and even a little bit more private of a setting. That's okay too, because not everybody's even comfortable in a group to share things. But sometimes sharing things gives a lot of freedom, and we want that for you.
We want you to have freedom.
Why you say it like that?
Until next time, this is it.
This is it.
Goodbye.